Bitcoin Matters.
Governments around the world are thinking about how they should approach the subject of Bitcoin and what they mistakenly call crypto assets. We've seen the internet grow beyond anyone's wildest imaginations without regulations, and we can expect the same thing will happen with Bitcoin. Today we'll take a look at the wrong way of approaching this subject. The British government has taken an unfortunate position on the matter of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies, and we will now go through the consultation results of Her Majesty's Treasury Report as an example of what not to do and how not to think about this new tool. In the report, it starts out by stating that crypto assets and most initial coin offerings, or ICOs, are currently not within the scope of FCA, Financial Conduct Authority, regulation. Akin, why shouldn't they be?
First of all, in order to understand this, we have to know what it is we're talking about specifically. These ICOs and all other software products are just that, software products. They're being offered on the market for a price. Now, they're no different to points in a game or messages sent by text or anything else. If a company has put out an ICO and they break their promise, that's breach of promise, and there's plenty of law that deals with that sort of bad behavior. There's no need for a special extra legislation to deal with any piece of software. You must remember, if they bring in new legislation to deal with software, then every single software product that's developed in the UK will be impacted. For example, if you have a Pokemon game or you have Pokebucks, that's going to be impacted. The very famous game called Farmville had something in it called Farmbucks. Nobody made a fuss about Farmbucks, despite the fact that over 86 million people were using that game on Facebook. So if we're going to approach this subject from a rational standpoint, you've got to look at exactly what it is, how it relates to other software products, and what you want the end effect to be. If you want your so-called Silicon Roundabout to be a vibrant place where software developers from all over the world are coming to incorporate and run their businesses, you cannot have one of the fundamental elements of software development, which is databases, covered by an irrational law. It's a recipe for disaster, and people are simply going to say, well, we're not going to bother with a jurisdiction that has this uncertainty. We're going to go somewhere else where we're allowed to develop our business models, allowed to write software and release it, and then take the consequences.
So the report goes on to say that crypto asset investors are currently afforded very little protection from the litany of risks, namely that there are no formal mechanisms for consumer redress nor compensation. So why should they be, and how are these risks different to other types of data loss?
The answer to that question is these new tools and products are not different from any other form of data. Her Majesty's government doesn't go out of its way to protect users of Microsoft Windows for disk failures, wiping out all of their family photos, all their emails and everything else. They don't take this attitude for anything else that's running on software. So the question needs to be asked, why are they so concerned about this particular form of data over other forms of data that they've not cared about at any time during the revolution of the home computer and the birth of the cell phone explosion that's put supercomputers in everybody's hands? Why is it that this particular form of database is different and requires their care and attention to lessen consumer risk? Now, you can make the argument that losing all your family photos is far more much of a loss than losing a couple of £100 in an ICO or losing your private keys to Bitcoin for a couple of £100. So what they have to explain is why they haven't cared until now about data loss. And why do they think that consumer redress is applicable in this, but not with, for example, Microsoft, which has produced buggy software, which has caused billions in losses across the economy? They've got to be consistent. Part of the reason why they're not consistent is because they've set up this false category of digital assets, which actually doesn't exist. And using this, they're taking it as a shoehorn to get themselves into the realm of software where they have no business sticking their noses in. So until they can explain why they don't legislate that Microsoft Windows must be absolutely secure and that consumer compensation must be in place for all the terrible things that Microsoft Windows does to its users when they introduce bugs, then they really cannot start to interfere in this realm.
This could literally apply to any software anywhere, iPhone, Android, I mean, anything that at least has a company behind it manufacturing it.
Not only that, what they could insist is that software developers are licensed and that all the software that anybody writes must be put through a government audit for soundness. So it's not just the operating systems that can be at fault. It's the applications that run on top of these operating systems that can also be at fault. So we're talking about software development. There's no such thing as crypto assets. This is something that they've just made up as a means to inveigle themselves into people's business. And they've got to address this by its nature. They've got to understand what they're talking about, and they can't analogize and then use that as a source of legislation.
Right. So let's talk about point 3. Point 3 is self-regulating bodies in the crypto asset industry, which set out codes of conduct and best practices for the industry, are wholly voluntary. Inevitably, there are firms that will ignore them. Akeen, is this sufficient?
It is sufficient because, well, first of all, there are examples in the real world that has nothing to do with software, where voluntary associations are self-policing of many different industries. The most famous one is Underwriters Laboratories. Now, if you want to get a certification from Underwriters Laboratories of your electrical goods, you have to send an example of what you're manufacturing to them, and they put it through rigorous testing for safety. And if it doesn't pass, you don't get the privilege of putting their sticker on your device. And people know if they don't see the Underwriters Laboratory sticker on there, that device isn't as trustworthy as one that does have that on it. And so for the software industry, it is perfectly natural and actually appropriate that there should be an industry body that looks after the terms of service and behavior of all the businesses that apply for such a certification. Now, once again, the problem of software auditing doesn't go away. And it's more likely that these associations will deal with the general demeanor and the terms of service and the service record of these companies rather than the details of the software that's being run to provide those services. Remember also, as is the case with Microsoft Windows and iOS and OS X, these software platforms are proprietary and they're trade secrets. So you're not going to get an industry body able to go in and do a line-by-line source code audit of these products. So it's not standard practice for that kind of invasive scrutiny to take place. And lo and behold, the whole world works on Apple, Microsoft, and other software providers without that kind of scrutiny. So it is sufficient for a wholly voluntary self-regulation of any industry as long as the people who are doing that regulation are trustworthy. And the market can sort this out. We have historical evidence saying that that's the case. What we know for sure is that the British government, which cannot produce software by itself, that has to outsource all of its software requirements to third parties, doesn't have the competence internally to be able to do any kind of assessment on whether software is sound or not sound. And in fact, the head of this committee used to be the education secretary. She has no expertise in IT or software. So, we have to start with the very honest assessment of the people who are doing this and their experience in this area. And I'm afraid it's lacking in this part of Her Majesty's government.
Yeah, sadly it sounds that way. As the government and regulators decide whether the current quote-unquote Wild West situation is allowed to continue and whether they are going to introduce regulation, consumers remain unprotected, it says. Can regulation actually protect users?
No, regulation cannot protect users. All regulation can do is stop the law abiding from doing bad things. Now, first of all, the internet has been very often called the Wild West. And actually, it's not a Wild West. It's a very ordered place. What they mean when they say Wild West situation is it's not something that they have personal control over. We know that the free market has produced the internet that we know and love today purely by being unregulated, without anybody telling anybody how to write websites, what sort of websites they can deliver, what sort of services they can deliver, and what terms. And we've all come to accept this fantastic tool that's changed everybody's lives for the better. So we know that the free market application of software development and services is the best way to deliver services. There's nothing wrong with having a free market system. And this use of the term Wild West is a pejorative term to cast this whole industry in a bad light, when in fact, that's absolutely the opposite of what the truth is. The truth is that the free market is the best way of delivering a wide range of services and iterating over them so that the consumers are served in the best possible fashion. And so, having said that, Britain doesn't have control over any other country other than itself. So they can bring in regulations to stop people from delivering and writing software. And that's fine. It's a sovereign country and they have that power to do that. But what people will do is they will leave the United Kingdom and go and develop software in a more free country. Now, normally I give the example of Skype, which was developed in Estonia. There's no reason why Skype couldn't have been developed in the UK. Software development can happen anywhere. The computers are the same. So why would they choose to go to Estonia to develop Skype rather than Shoreditch in London? Another example, which is related directly to Bitcoin, is blockchain.info. Blockchain.info used to be incorporated in the UK under a company name called QCOS, and now they're incorporated in, I believe, Luxembourg. Why would they leave the UK for Luxembourg? And this is before this Treasury Committee report or the threat that they're going to change the way they look at databases and software development in the UK. There's obviously something not correct about the way businesses are treated in the UK, which causes people to proactively leave. So I don't think that this report is going to make people more confident about incorporating in the UK, because no businessman, no entrepreneur wants more trouble, more regulation. The vast majority of entrepreneurs and business people are totally honest and only want to serve the public. So all of this stuff, these pejorative Wild West character assassinations and everything else is not very welcoming, I have to say. So there are other places where people can incorporate, and the ways, and in particular in software, which is not like manufacturing cars, it can be done literally from anywhere. The developers can be anywhere in the world and contribute to the project. So a jurisdiction that wants to attract entrepreneurs to incorporate in their countries needs to be making the opposite of this kind of sound. And regulation cannot protect users. At best, they can mandate that compensation is made available if there are accidents in the software development. But that always happens. No software is bug-free. So if you have a system of compensation for software bugs, if you're based in the UK, you immediately have an inevitable cost, because no software is perfect, that's going to be applied to your business. Nobody who is sane is going to put up with that. So you've got to understand, once again, what it is you're dealing with. Regulation can't protect people. Regulation can only act as a burden on the people who are providing a service. And there's already enough law to cover fraud and other malicious activities that inevitably a tiny minority will engage in. For the normal people, regulation is of no value either to the consumer or to the producer of services.
In deciding the regulatory approach, the government and regulators should evaluate the risks of crypto assets and assess whether their growth should be encouraged. If growth is favored, regulation could lead to positive outcomes for the crypto asset market, including the move toward a more mature business model and increased liquidity. Akin, how can the government measure risk without looking at the software?
They can't. The only way that they could possibly do this is by outsourcing, once again, this task to an outside company, and then prevent people from releasing software until they've completed a government audit and had a seal of approval. Now, that, of course, won't guarantee that bugs haven't been introduced, because it's very hard to find bugs. Also, because there's so many people developing software, there's no way that they can audit all the software that's being written in the UK and elsewhere. So this idea that evaluating the risk of quote unquote crypto assets, which we know don't exist, is frankly absurd. And once again, they're using this term crypto assets as if it's a real thing just because they say it is. And of course, it isn't. We're talking about software. We're talking about software development. Also, they say the growth of this type of software should be encouraged. Now, they can ban the writing of certain classes of software in the UK. but that's the only place they can ban it. This is why Silicon Valley is in California and not in the UK, because software is a form of writing. And in the United States, you have the right to write software. It's enshrined in the First Amendment of the Constitution. In a country where there is no written constitution and you have no guaranteed rights, then people can say that certain types of writing should be encouraged or discouraged. In free countries, you don't get that. So this is very problematic. This whole paragraph 5 is very, very problematic. Another point is that they're trying to regulate how markets work. Now, that's what happens in socialist countries, where the government has the fantastic idea, which is totally wrong, that they can control the economy and manage the economy. We know that this doesn't work. That's why socialism doesn't work. So it's also not the place of governments to decide what business models are good and what business models are not good. That's what the market does. And if Britain doesn't want to allow the market to figure out what's good and what's not good, that's perfectly fine. There are other places where this experimentation is going to happen. Look at BitMEX, which is running in, of all places, Hong Kong under the communist Chinese. It's one of the biggest software companies dealing with Bitcoin on earth, making literally billions of dollars. They've just bought a whole floor on the most expensive office building in Hong Kong. Now, there's no reason why that floor shouldn't have been bought in the Shard in London. But the reason why they're not based in the UK is because of reports like this, which give every single entrepreneur who's thinking about moving to London cold feet. They say that they're going to have some kind of answer on top of this answer by 2019. Every single entrepreneur who has read this report has now struck Britain off of the list of places where they're going to incorporate, because they're at very minimum are going to say, well, let's wait and see what the landscape is going to be like before we put down roots in the UK. That means all the developers that were going to be hired here are not going to be hired here. That means all the investment that was going to be made is not going to be made here. This kind of chilling effect is very, very toxic to the developer community and software ecosystem, software production ecosystem in the UK. And it's a drastic, drastic mistake. And they've deliberately ignored all of the advice that was given to them by people who are actually doing the work. And all the respondents to this report were people like journalists from the Financial Times that have no stake in the way that the software is being developed. You would have thought they would reach out to software developers who are working in this field to tell them what is it that we need to do to help you. And of course, we would have just said, stay out of the way. Stay out of the way and everything will be fine. Don't worry about it. But that's not the world that we live in. Thankfully, there are places where software developers can go where they can develop the software they need to develop, experiment with the business models, and make a profit or loss and take that profit or loss as a consequence of what they're doing. And they will go to those places and do the work that's necessary, and they will profit.
Yeah, that's a good segue into my next point. Item 6, it's if the UK develops a proportionate regulatory environment for crypto assets, the UK could be well placed to become a global center for this activity. And I'll just say that I think this is a really misguided way of looking at markets. Central planners always seem to think that they are smart enough to regulate extremely complex and dynamic economic systems. Perhaps if they were omniscient like God or something, they could, but they aren't. So government regulation always causes unintended consequences. And the same applies here. The market can decide on its own without government intervention whether Bitcoin or any other type of altcoin is valuable. And if left to its own devices, the market would obviously eventually adapt Bitcoin because of its sound monetary policy and not use any of these other altcoins. So I fear that the government intervention will actually artificially inflate interest in these scam coins and give them legitimacy that they don't actually deserve.
That's exactly right. And with people believing that the government is somehow backing one idea over another one or providing some kind of financial guarantee that losses will be minimized, this will actually encourage bad business designs, bad software designs, bad business models to enter into the market and try, because the government is there acting as a guarantor. And when they say proportionate regulatory environment, what does that actually mean? It doesn't mean anything. Proportionate in terms of what? I mean, in the United States, there is no proportionate regulation of speech. Speech is a right. So you can't have a proportionate regulation of speech in a free country. And I can tell you 100% guarantee that Britain will not become a global center for this activity if there's a regulatory environment preventing people from releasing software to the public. It's simply not going to happen. They're going to go to free countries where they can write and release the software that they want to release and write.
Yes, absolutely. So in point 7, they say currencies act as a medium of exchange, a store of value, or a unit of account. There are no cryptocurrencies that perform these functions currently, and as cryptocurrencies are being used widely for speculation, well-functioning cryptocurrencies exist only as a theoretical concept. Accordingly, this report uses the term cryptoassets as it's more helpful and meaningful in describing Bitcoin and many other altcoins. So I think right off the bat, what strikes me about that is that, first of all, currencies do not act as medium of exchange, store of value, or a unit of account. A currency embodies all three of those properties at the same time. Now, this is a really interesting point because I think for the Austrian economists out there, those folks that might understand this stuff a little bit, I don't think we can honestly call Bitcoin money just yet if we're trying to adopt this definition of what is a currency. Bitcoin, as far as I'm aware, has not been adopted in almost any of the markets in the world as a currency that is used as a medium of exchange, store of value, and unit of account, except maybe in altcoin markets. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not being used as a medium of exchange and that it's not being used as a store of value, because it certainly is. But I'm just being a bit of a stickler to the definition, I guess. I just don't think that we're there yet in most markets. Maybe we want to think about Bitcoin as a commodity right now. That might be a better definition for it. But regardless, Bitcoin has the potential to become money in most markets someday, whether that's through, just general market adoption or post-hyper-Bitcoinization. But regardless of which, the term they use in this report, crypto assets, is just, I think it's a poor term. It's confusing. It doesn't make sense to me what it actually even means.
Well, I think they've just made this term up, or somebody who's advised this committee has given them this term for them to conjure with. Whether or not Bitcoin is money or not is beyond the scope of this report. We know that Bitcoin can be used as money. We know that it can be used as a medium of exchange, and it can store value, and it's a unit of account because people use it as that. So for them to say that it's so-called cryptocurrencies don't perform those functions is flat out wrong. It's just totally false. So the fact that some people are speculating on the value of these things has nothing to do with their nature. It's completely irrelevant. Once again, this is a socialist thinking about people who are making money as a bad thing. That's actually the true source of that line. Cryptocurrencies are being used widely for speculation. That's absolutely irrelevant to what we're talking about, which is whether or not practice of writing software should come under government regulation. That's what this is actually about. And all of this in paragraph 7 is a means of casting this whole argument in the image of a threat. And they're doing this as a pretext to regulation. These people don't understand what Bitcoin is. And all of these definitions that are floating around, and there are a lot of them, and it's very interesting that people have all these ideas of what Bitcoin is. They're trying to explain how it works and how people can use it. And that's perfectly fine. But that doesn't have any impact or relation to the processes that are happening in the software on the metal. And that's what counts here, not what people view Bitcoin as. And I'll give you the example. Samurai Wallet has just taken fiat out of its wallet. So when you use Samurai Wallet, all you get is an integer, or actually it's a fraction, that shows how much Bitcoin you have, your ability to send Bitcoin onto the network. And when you receive Bitcoin, it shows you another number. That's all it does. So if Bitcoin had started off like this and not had developers putting fiat in as a means of understanding how much the Bitcoin is worth, then perhaps we wouldn't be having these arguments with Her Majesty's Treasury about what Bitcoin as a so-called crypto asset. They would treat it more like text messaging or WhatsApp or other services like that, which are clearly not money by using their definition. If that's not the case, why don't these people say that text messages are a form of crypto asset. Why not? Doesn't make any sense. All of these messages that go across WhatsApp are secured with public key cryptography in the same way that Bitcoin messages are, the difference being who controls the database. So you could make the argument that a WhatsApp message between two people is quote unquote a crypto asset because it's encrypted text being sent from one client to another client. This is once again an example of people who don't have any understanding of how these things work under the hood, trying to get to grips with them by analogy. And that's perfectly fine. But you cannot use these analogies as a basis of making law and making recommendations for new law, because you're going to have knock-on effects that will impact the whole of software practice in a country, and nobody in their right mind is going to put up with it.
Yeah, good point. Definitely good point. And we'll move on to point 8. So several crypto asset exchanges, which are used to convert crypto assets into conventional currencies, have been hacked and customers' crypto assets have been stolen. As there's no collective insurance deposit scheme to compensate investors in the event of a hack, the rise of hacking associated with crypto assets may not be something that investors in conventional assets have experience with. Therefore, they may not be well placed to judge the risk. This constitutes further evidence that crypto assets are particularly ill-suited to retail investors. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's another paragraph of utter nonsense. First of all, if you are a retail investor or a professional investor, you don't have access to the source code of any of these tools. That's a fact. So you have no way of assessing whether they're sound or whether they're not sound. And note again that they're using this term crypto asset, which doesn't exist. Now, these so-called crypto asset exchanges are no different from the Hollywood Stock Exchange, which did not come under regulation or under scrutiny of any kind. Why not? Why is this artificial category that's been created out of nothing suddenly been put into everybody's minds as a means to regulate what is a very common practice, software development? It doesn't make any sense. Now, when it comes to hacking, we know that Google Plus has just suffered a big reported that they've just suffered a very large intrusion of about 500,000 of their users. Facebook has also been under similar attacks where information is exfiltrated from their servers. Why isn't the government saying that these services must have in place consumer compensation programs so that when their personal information is hacked, the users who have their data copied should be compensated? Why is it that in Bitcoin and in this whole area that special rules have to apply? Because essentially we're talking about the same thing across all of these services. It's all data all the time. It's all databases all the time. So they have to explain why Facebook is not forced to participate in a deposit insurance scheme or a Facebook posting insurance scheme to compensate Facebook users in events of the inevitable hacks that happen to them. Why not? Why do they ignore that and concentrate on something like Bitcoin, which is vanishingly small compared to the size of Google Plus, Facebook, Twitter, and all of these other services that have suffered attacks on a regular basis? And let's not forget the gaming industry. Sony had an enormous hack where the PlayStation data of millions of users was copied after an intrusion. Why was the Treasury Department silent about that, but they have something to say about Bitcoin? It doesn't make any sense. This whole argument they're making is not logical, and it can be pulled apart by anybody who has even a cursory understanding of how these things work.
Point 9 is that crypto asset exchanges are not currently included in AML or anti-money laundering regulations. Owing to this and their inherent anonymity, crypto assets can facilitate the sale and purchase of illicit goods and services and can be used to launder the proceeds of crime. The committee recognizes that the EU's fifth AML directive, which will require crypto asset exchanges to comply with AML regulations, is a step forward. However, the government's consultation on transposing the EU's fifth AML directive into UK regulation is not expected to finish until the end of 2019. The committee has urged the government to prioritize and expedite the transposition. So I'll just say that if people want to launder money or launder crypto assets, they're going to find a way to do it. Anti-money laundering regulation isn't going to change that fact, and it happens all over the world today with fiat currencies. And if people want to break the law with Bitcoin or Litecoin and try to find a way to launder those things, they're going to do it. They're going to find a way.
And also, we mustn't forget that there was a report by, I think it was Interpol, saying that the amount of money that's being done in this activities, illicit activities, is vanishingly small. Very, very, very small. This is a problem that quite simply does not exist. And so for them to be making this argument, they have to prove that this is a problem in the first place. Why are they saying this if there is no problem? Now, they say crypto asset exchanges, which actually don't exist, are not included in AML regulations. Well, if they're going to say that, then they're going to have to take Rainbow Siege 6 scores and put those into the AML regulations also. Similarly with Farmville, those farm bucks, are they going to put that in the regulations as well? When people buy goods online with Bitcoin, those goods can be, for example, music files. Are they going to say now that people buying music files with Bitcoin are going to have to identify themselves and be KYC AML? The whole thing is absolutely ridiculous. And don't forget also that you can buy an Amazon gift card for $500 and buy that with cash or a credit card and then spend that gift card online without ever having to show any ID. So why is it that an Amazon gift card or an iTunes gift card or any one of the other numerous gift cards that are out there are subject to a different regime than Bitcoin is? Essentially, they're exactly the same. They're just a token that is used to access a database. You scratch off the back, put in the 16-digit number, and then lo and behold, you've got $500 on Amazon to buy goods of basically any description, including digital goods. So this, once again, is born of a total misunderstanding of how business is being done online, what Bitcoin is, and what money is for that matter. And this is completely aside from the idea that money laundering is or is not a crime. We can leave that aside and just show that it's not rational by looking at all the other services that are available in the market that don't come under this ridiculous idea. And that includes people buying top-ups for mobile phones. You don't have to show any ID to buy £50 worth of call time. Why should you be forced to show ID for buying £50 worth of Bitcoin? Doesn't make any sense. So once again, other jurisdictions are going to get this right, and getting this right means not interfering with business. And businesses are going to move to those jurisdictions and they're going to serve everybody on earth. Blockchain.info, one of the biggest Bitcoin wallets in the whole world, is serving everybody on earth from Luxembourg. They don't have to put up with the UK regulations. They don't have to put up regulations of any place. They are releasing a software platform to whoever wants to use it. Just like you can download Linux and use it to run your processes on your computer. Bitcoin is no different. Bitcoin companies releasing software is no different to that either. So you can set up these straw men and these false pretexts all you like. You have that right. You have that power because Britain is a sovereign country. But then don't come back later when the new Silicon Valley of Bitcoin is in Hong Kong instead of in Shoreditch. Don't come back and say, why hasn't it happened here? We want to have the same thing. No, you're not going to get it because nobody's going to put up with this irrational nonsense. They're going to go where the regulation is correct. That means the existing bodies of law where fraud is forbidden and very actionable. And they're going to go to these places and prosper there and serve everybody on earth.
And that'll lead us into our final point, point 10. Blockchain is an electronic ledger that records and verifies transactions made using crypto assets. Moving away from its origins with Bitcoin, blockchain has more recently been described as a database that works as a decentralized way of storing large amounts of data. A fundamental drawback of decentralized blockchains is the slow, costly, and energy-intensive verification process for transactions. This may ultimately limit the extent to which crypto assets and blockchain can replace conventional money and payment systems. But the committee does recognize that blockchain technology may have the potential to be a more efficient method of managing certain types of data in the long term. Yeah, I mean, honestly, a blockchain is only good for securing one thing, and that's Bitcoin. It's a huge waste of computing power otherwise. There are so many things that people want to use blockchain for today. It's ridiculous. But, I mean, proof of work is costly for a reason. It's securing Bitcoin, which is highly valuable. I think it's absurd that people want to strip that away from Bitcoin and use it for other purposes. It just doesn't make sense. There are other means and technologies out there that can achieve the same thing without being a blockchain.
Well, this paragraph is the killer paragraph of this whole very shabby and sorry report. There is no such thing as blockchain. That's just a fact. There's no such thing as blockchain. The whole reason why Bitcoin was designed the way it was is because there's a problem of trust. So Bitcoin was designed so that nobody has to trust anybody. Everything is verified. The idea that you can take Bitcoin and all the incentives out of the system and have something that's useful is totally absurd. But what this paragraph shows is that they've been dictated to. This has been dictated to them. It shows a complete lack of understanding of what this whole new category of software is, how it works, what it's for. And let's just take it at face value. They say the fundamental drawback of decentralized blockchains is the slow, costly, and energy-intensive verification process for transactions. So what they're saying is that there's a fundamental drawback, which means something that cannot be fixed. Why are you so worried about regulating it? You saying it's fundamentally broken, then it can't work. So what's the point of wasting parliamentary time writing legislation to control Bitcoin? It doesn't make any sense. You say it's going to be ultimately limit the extent to which crypto assets, which don't exist, and blockchain can replace conventional money. Well, then, if that's the case, if it's going to ultimately limit the spread of this new tool, which you're basically saying it's doomed, then there's nothing to report on. There's no need to enact special regulations, special laws, or anything to do with this because it's not going to work. So they can't have it both ways. Well, of course, they'll try, but they can't. They can't approach this from the position of computer illiteracy and encourage people to work in this field in their country at the same time. They can't say it doesn't work, but it does work. They can't say it's a threat of money laundering, but it doesn't work. The whole thing is contradictory. It's very, very sad to see people making this kind of fundamental mistake when we know for a fact that Britain is stocked to the gills with software geniuses who are contributing to the world, like blockchain.info. Blockchain.info was written by a British man. So Britain can produce these world-class, world-changing software companies. But over and over again, they end up leaving Britain precisely because of reports like this. They leave Britain and go to the United States, they go to other countries outside of the EU, where they can incorporate and do the kind of innovation that changes everything. So it's very unfortunate that they've published this. It's a red flag to anybody who wants to start a business offering these services to the public. We already know, for example, that Giftoff, which ran their ICO, opted not to do it in the United States because the SEC was making all kinds of noises about ICOs. They chose to do it in a mix of Singapore, the UK, and one other jurisdiction. So people are waking up to the fact that you can incorporate anywhere, you can run your operations from anywhere and avoid all the toxic jurisdictions. It's very sad to say, but it seems like Britain is hell-bent on being one of those toxic jurisdictions where people will not touch it with a 9-foot barge pole because they know as soon as they get here, administrative burdens and regulatory burdens on them are going to be so withering that it'll be impossible for them to start up. And of course, they have the example of New York to look to with their bit license, where nobody is going to incorporate because they know that in order to start, you have to have over $1 million to comply with all the ridiculous regulatory nonsense that was brought in by Ben Lasky and the NYDFS or whatever it's called. So this is a double mistake by the British government. They have an example of what happens when you make these kinds of noises in the shape of New York. Everybody runs for the hills, and yet they want to duplicate it here. It doesn't make any sense. We've written to Her Majesty's government on 2 occasions, outlining this in very simple terms, in a very thorough fashion, and they've chosen to opt for another path. Once again, they have the right to do that, but Bitcoin is not going to be stopped. Bitcoin, just like cellular telephones, GSM, the software revolution is going to happen. And all that work's going to be done in other countries. And that work's going to be done by British people in those other countries. Only the people who live in the UK who are going to suffer by not having those companies here, nurturing the talent here through apprenticeships and all the other things that people do to bring software developers on stream. And it's their own fault. And they cannot say that they were not warned.
This week's question is from Twitter user Ephraim at Harp of the Spirit, who asks, will other cryptocurrencies have a place in a future where Bitcoin is dominant, or at least more prevalent?
Thank you for your question. Without a doubt, there's only going to be Bitcoin in the future. Bitcoin is going to win, and it's going to be the sole money of the entire internet, and all altcoins are going to die. The reason why we can make this prediction is by understanding the way that the internet works as a model. Everybody on the internet, every single service is all running on a single set of protocols that everybody agrees to. In order for effects of scale to lock in, everybody has to be on the same set of rails, essentially. So altcoins are not on the same set of rails as Bitcoin. So you have, first of all, the effects of the software, which once they gain mass adoption, everybody will settle on as a standard protocol for communication. But you also have the economic forces on top of that, where everybody wants the same money to be able to transact with. So if we take these two things in combination, Bitcoin is going to be the only means of paying and being paid on the internet in the future. Altcoins have no future. And so what people call multi-coinism is absolutely doomed and totally irrational. It's not taking into account any of the history or the facts of other tools and how they've spread and how they've come to dominate. So we must be very clear about this. There's only going to be Bitcoin. Now, of course, in the meantime, you might have a blip of some upstart launching a coin to people who don't know exactly what it is they're getting into. They're doing it for speculation. Well, that's perfectly fine. But in the end, there will be only Bitcoin. That's going to be the way that people send value to and from themselves on the internet. That's absolutely inevitable. Make no mistake about it. And this is not a political position or a cult position or something that fanboys are divided over. This is just reality. This is just the way things actually work. We know that they work this way because we've seen it before.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that in monetary economics, if you're just going to assume that Bitcoin assumes the role of money and you study history, what you see is that one money always dominates a market. It's competitive, it's ruthless, it's like survival of the fittest. And Bitcoin is right now the strongest, the most robust. And over time, may not happen today, it may not happen in a week or a month or a year or two even, but eventually these altcoins will one by one be driven out and killed, and there's just going to be no place for them left in the market.
Exactly right. And you're starting to see this in the way that these exchanges are delisting some of these dead coins. It's very easy to spin up a coin, make some graphics and launch it, and then get people to buy it. But that's not what's actually happening. What's actually happening is under the hood. And Bitcoin has the most developers, the most talented developers, which you cannot source from anywhere. So the momentum of Bitcoin is now totally unstoppable. This isn't a matter of opinion. This isn't a matter of fanboyism or being on a side like schoolgirls saying who loves who. This is just reality. And so Bitcoin is going to be the dominant way that value transactions are done over the internet, mediated over the internet, whether it's between people, machines, buying stuff, selling stuff, doesn't matter what it is. And so this is now totally inevitable. And there are some people who call themselves Bitcoin maximalists. Well, actually, that's a slur invented by a young man who is running an altcoin. And it's not actually a real thing at all. There's no need to have a category of people called so-called Bitcoin maximalism. It's just reality. And so I'm very happy to be able to answer this question and put out of anybody's mind that certainly anybody here is a multi-coiner, because that's absolutely not the case.
So thanks again to Ephraim for submitting your question this week. Ephraim, we'll be sending you an Azteco Bitcoin voucher. If you'd like us to answer your question on the next episode of Bitcoin Matters, please send us a message by visiting bitcoinmatterspodcast.com. The selected winner will receive an Azteco Bitcoin voucher. Thank you for tuning in to Bitcoin Matters. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a thumbs up on YouTube or a review in the iTunes Store. To learn more about Bitcoin Matters, please visit us at bitcoinmatterspodcast.com.